Hey, if you're a fan of the band Rush, I think you're going to enjoy what we have for you here today. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on permanent waves for a long, long time. And as you know, one of the things we do on this channel a lot is we go back and we find old record reviews, concert reviews, interviews, that kind of thing. And there is so much stuff about permanent waves that we found. And so this won't be the only video we do about permanent waves. But what we're going to share with you here in a minute is we found two different record reviews that were put out in 1980 when this record came out. And one of them, the person really likes the record, and the other one, the person doesn't really like it. And I think if you're a Rush fan especially, you will enjoy listening to these two things. So a side note really quickly about these videos that we produce. A lot of these videos, like when we do the magazine read-throughs, and many times when we do these records where we look at the actual cover, we shoot these things in 4K resolution. And so if you're watching this on YouTube especially, make sure you have it set to the highest possible resolution, because when we look at things like this record, sometimes we get down into the detail, and if you have your monitor or if you have your YouTube settings at 4K, it'll help you see the detail that we're looking at when we look at this record. Now, I know a lot of the people that watch this channel are roughly my age, and many of us have had similar experiences with this stuff. For me, I think the very first two songs, and it's so hard to remember these things, of course, but I believe the first songs that I ever heard from Rush were The Spirit of Radio and Free Will, which of course both come off of this album. And I remember recording them off of the radio and having them on a cassette tape and just listening to them over and over and over, and especially Free Will. I was so fascinated with that song. Absolutely loved it. I loved the guitar line. I loved the lyrics. I don't know, there was really something about it. And of course, those first two songs on the album, The Spirit of Radio and Free Will, were relatively radio friendly. And so they were kind of entering a new phase. Now, they had so many great album covers, but this is got to be one of their best. And partly because there's a little bit of humor on here, and it's filled with puns. When you take the name of the album, which is Permanent Waves, there's so many different puns that can come out of that idea. And there's several of them just on the cover of this album, which makes it really, really, really interesting. Now, of course, you have this scene, which is from a hurricane in Texas from 1961. And then you have this woman superimposed over the top. Obviously, they're two separate pictures kind of put together. And this woman's name is Paula Turnbull. And they basically took a bunch of photos with her to kind of capture a little bit of that 1950s look and a little bit of that 7-Year Itch Marilyn Monroe thing with the dress. Now, a couple of interesting things on this album cover. One of the things over here, you'll see that we actually have the last names of the guys in the band there. You have Lee, you have Peart, you have Lifeson. And over here, this is Hugh Syme. This is the artist that created this album cover. And it's kind of interesting because he's waving. And it's in some ways, if you want to get really deep into it, it is a permanent wave now that it's on this printed picture right here. Again, like I said, there's some really interesting puns when you start really digging into this album cover. But to me, one of the most interesting things about this album cover that is, I think, often kind of overlooked, and it's this really interesting, subtle thing that's done on here. Now, there was an artistic choice that Hugh Syme made when he made this album cover, and it is that he put a frame around it. So instead of having this picture go all the way out to the edge, he actually just put this black frame around the edge. And look right there. The one thing that goes outside, that breaks the frame, is the blowing dress. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time getting into the symbolism here, but it is kind of fascinating that you have this person that in some ways symbolizes the permanence. You know, she's the one that has the perm in her hair. She's the one that represents kind of this classical beauty. And like I said, I'm not going to get into too much analysis here, but it just is interesting. And I'd love to get your feedback on this too. Why was it that he had this one thing that extended, that actually broke the frame? And the thing he chose to break the frame was the edge of her dress that was blowing, that they'd taken a fan actually in the studio where they took this picture to cause her dress to blow like that. And they chose to have that be the thing that breaks the frame. Okay, let's flip it over and just look at a couple other things. These are great pictures of the guys right here. And then let's take a look on the inside, because there is something really interesting on the inside too that you may not have seen before. These are obviously also, one of the reasons I love these pictures is it's like in these photos, they had really embraced their rock and roll nerdiness. Just there's something about that you see this, and you know where some of the albums before you'd seen them trying to have a certain look or something, especially like on 2112. Not here. It's like we are just officially kind of rock nerds, and this is just what we do. Anyway, I loved that about especially the glasses. I mean, how do you beat that? That's so awesome. But one of the things that I remember from hearing Free Will when I was a kid, and it was one of the lyrics, and I know it wasn't a new idea, but it was the first time that I'd ever heard it. And I'm sure everybody can remember the line in the song Free Will that says, "If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice." Now, one of the interesting things about this album and the album, the inner sleeve here, is look at the lyric for Free Will. Here's the song Free Will, and look right here. If you still choose not to decide, you cannot have made a choice. Isn't that amazing? It's such an obvious misprint in the lyrics on what is perhaps one of the most significant lyrics. Like everybody remembers that lyric from this song. It's one of Rush's most significant lyrics in all of their lyrics, because everybody remembers that one from that song, and it's one that's totally wrong in the inner sleeve. Now, if you go on Rush.com, because you have the lyrics for all the songs on their website, it's actually correct. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. But here on the inner sleeve, it's actually printed incorrectly. And so anyway, this was such an amazing album. But one of my favorite parts of this album, of course, those first two songs, love them. I can listen to them kind of nonstop, and I don't know that I would ever get sick of them. They're so fascinating. But one of my favorite also parts of this album comes in the middle of Natural Science. And it's this part, it's in hyperspace, and it is so amazing. Oh my gosh, it's so cool. Listening to the band tear into that. And then when Geddy starts to sing, you have this, it's almost like a reverse reverb. And then it comes into his voice and he starts singing, and it is just, the effects they put on his voice for that piece of this song they're so great. It's so amazing. And if you haven't taken the time to listen to that recently, go break that out. It is such a fascinating thing, that piece of music right there, hyperspace in the middle of this Natural Science song. And another thing, just while we're talking about interesting things to listen to, if you haven't listened to the guitar solo in Free Will recently, go back and listen to that with headphones on. Because one of the things you'll notice is that they do just this very subtle panning with Alex's guitar, because you'll hear it as you're listening to it, and you won't notice this so much as listening to it in your speakers. When you put it on headphones, you really hear it. It just kind of goes back and forth very subtly between your ears as he's playing this guitar solo, and it just adds to this really incredible depth and dimension to what is still, in my opinion, one of my favorite songs they ever did, the song Free Will. Okay, now we're going to jump over to these articles that I think you're going to find fascinating, especially if you're a Rush fan. I think you'll love this stuff. And like I said, these are two different reviews of this album. And you know, again, this was a little bit of a change. And so you'll hear this first one I'm going to read to you. You'll actually hear this person recognizing that this was a little bit of a change in the career of Rush. And as I said, this is really cool. So this comes from, let's see here. This comes from the Abilene Reporter-News, Abilene, Texas, January 27th of 1980. And this album came out on January 14th. So the album's only been out like a couple of weeks now. And this record review is titled, Rush Releases Powerful Wave. Neil Young once said that rock and roll will never die. It may never die, but it does evolve. The music industry has had to contend with many mutations surfacing, vying for a chance to please the ever-changing tastes of the 20th century ear. The recent innovations and reverberations have been labeled new wave by critics in the know, basically because they will roll onto the charts, make a splash, and then return whence they came, obscurity. Yet amidst the predicted ephemeral destinies professed by rock critics of new wave, a three-man Canadian band has confidently titled their latest LP release Permanent Waves. And that is such an interesting thing to think about, because this whole idea of new wave had come in, and there is that symbol of how things are waves cause things to constantly change, and this whole idea of a permanent wave versus something that was coming in or really important at that time, which was called new wave. And to tie this together, I want to read something from the last line in the last part of the song Permanent Waves. Now listen to this, because this has a really important symbol. So it's right here. Wave after wave will flow with the tide and bury the world as it does. Tide after tide will flow and recede, leaving life to go on as it was. And again, it's so interesting recognizing this whole idea of these waves and tide, how they will come in and make these major changes, but they create something new in the process. It just, like I said, you could probably spend hours just kind of dissecting all this symbolism that comes with this. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting tie-in with what he was saying right there. In bold support of their musical genre, not really new wave, but old wave, if there is such a classification, and in outright defiance of adult-oriented rock, Rush has splashed onto the 33 1/3 shoreline and shows no signs of ebbing. Now, I'm sure most people watching this understand it, but I know we do have a few younger people. The idea of 33 1/3 is that these records, of course, that's the speed that they spun at, 33 1/3 RPMs. Okay, and that's what it's referring to there. In the tradition of Rush, A Farewell to Kings, 2112, and Hemispheres, Permanent Waves has the makings of another gold album for the group, should it reach that goal. It would make this LP the trio's 5th gold in this country. Rush already has 6 gold and 3 platinum albums in Canada, and in April of '79, they received a Silver Disc Award for British sales of Farewell to Kings. Rush is described by the New York Times as energetic progressive rock with a strong science fantasy overlay, and labeled by the Los Angeles Times as, quote, a 3-man band destined for extinction. I love reading stuff like this, because again, we have, when we read these things, we have the, history. We know all the things that happened after this, and we're listening to people saying these things in the moment. Moving Pictures doesn't exist, which, by the way, is another album that has some cool puns on it. Exit Stage Left, and just going on and on and on. All the stuff that would happen after that. None of that exists. None of that decades later, still filling up arenas. They don't know that. So it makes this so much more interesting. A 3-man band destined for extinction, and they could not have been any more wrong. Because they were truly destined for legend status. As much as any other band had ever been a legend, they reached it. Okay. Despite the forecasts, Rush continues to pack in audiences where they play. Although their album sales keep them a mid-level band, Rush is satisfied with the success they have achieved. Because there are only 3 men playing, Rush avoids the crowding and cluttering that larger groups must contend with, not to mention the splitting of the money. Bass player and lead singer Geddy Lee, lead guitarist Alex Lifeson, and drummer Neil Peart combine forces to present tight, crisp, forceful rock. Rush uses a synthesizer and a mini-moog in nearly all their cuts without being abusive. And that is such an interesting thing to recognize. Their use of the synthesizer is it's sparing and tasteful. It never really gets obtrusive didn't I just pull a companion unobtrusive? Anyway, I didn't mean to do that, but it does not become obtrusive in the music. When they add those synthesizers in these songs, you notice them, but kind of only if you're listening for them. Because what they really do with them is they just kind of fill in and help the movement of the music. It's rare that they actually take that instrument and make it a focal point of the song. It's just these subtle things that they put in there. For the most part, on this album, that's how it's used. Okay. And that's his point here. Nearly all their cuts without being abusive. On side one of Waves, The Spirit of Radio is a tribute to radio and comes across very well. The best song on side one is Free Will. The number expresses the group's unanimity of philosophy, individuality. The third cut on side one is Jacob's Ladder, which starts out with a mellow fretboard from Lifeson and goes into a mezzo forte overture using Lee's synthesizer pedal. Peart keeps the tempo, which never drags, and steps up the beat as the song crescendos triumphantly, only to return to a mellow, almost reverent finale. Jacob's Ladder is a musical analogy reminiscent of those spring thunderstorms which strike up and drench and then go on their way. I think this guy does such a great job of these very simple descriptions of what he's listening to. He obviously kind of gets the music. Side two is even more than music. It's a social comment. Entre nous, which loosely translates from French as within us, attempts to explain the reasons humanity, having reached such platitudes in self-awareness, falls flat on its face when it attempts to communicate with others. Set to music, the lyrics present a promising picture of how mankind benefits from such shortcomings. Different strings massages the tympanic membrane, a pleasing number that is intended to provide tonal appreciation rather than evoke cerebral searching. And this is actually something interesting about this too, because Neil, of course, is the lyricist for almost everything that Rush does, but this is one of those exceptions. And if you look right here, so here's different strings, the lyrics, and then if you look right there, you'll see music by Lee and Lifeson, lyrics by Lee. So this is the one song on this album where Geddy Lee wrote the lyrics. A pleasing number that is intended to provide tonal appreciation rather than evoke cerebral searching. The final cut on side two is Natural Science in 3 movements: tide pools, hyperspace, and permanent waves. The first movement was meticulously assembled on the shore of a Canadian lake, where Lifeson and Peart laboriously splashed oars to record tide pool effects. The result in the finished product are tremendous. Hyperspace uses what is called interface, a device which allows Lee to trigger all of the voices in his polyphonic synthesizer by depressing only one pedal. For the third and final movement, the band moved outside across the lake and then recorded. Voices, timpani, guitar sounds were all sent out over the lake to make use of its natural echo. The final product is permanent waves of good sounds. All cuts on the album are music by Lee and Lifeson and lyrics by Peart, except for different strings for which Lee did the lyrics, which we just talked about a second ago. When looking for Rush's Permanent Waves at your favorite album shop, look for the album sleeve with the sultry wench on the cover whose skirt has caught a breeze, a permanent breeze. Okay, so anyway, that's a guy that actually likes the music, and I thought that was so interesting what he had to say about it. Now, this person, not so much. And again, when I read these things, I'd love to get your feedback on what they have to say, and do you relate to it? And if so, specifically, what is it you relate to? So here we go. So now this one is Rush is a hit with somebody. And then there's a picture of Neil Peart right there. And it says drummer Neil Peart of the Canadian rock band Rush. All right, here we go. When the Rush album came out, it appeared that the Canadian band had done some kind of about-face because of the title, Permanent Waves. There had just been a decent sampler of new wave music called Permanent Wave. As soon as the stereo needle hit the vinyl, it was obvious that the band was still into a heavily layered, overblown sound. Off the turntable and back into the jacket went the album. With some dread, the thought came that Permanent Waves would probably be a hit and demand closer attention. The record is in the top 10 now, and Rush is playing two 7:30 p.m. concerts at the Coliseum on Tuesday and Wednesday with the group 38 Special. That's actually pretty interesting too, 38 Special, just thinking of the two of those bands together. After listening to Permanent Waves at length, the most generous thing that comes to mind is that there's a lot to be said for first impressions. Rush's vocalist Geddy Lee sounds a bit like the late Mark Bolan of T-Rex, like a Mark Bolan with terminally tight pants. Musically, Rush is so pretentious as to be laughable, all the way to the bank, apparently. The single greatest lowlight of Permanent Waves is the lyrics. At the risk of selling a few more copies for them, the lyrics are rather like what you'd get from Rod McCune with a sci-fi bent. A song called Natural Science is divided into three parts. The first is called Tide Pools, and McCune could relate to its blither about the ebbing tide and wheels within wheels, but would probably forego the use of words like microcosmic. Maybe not. The second part is called Hyperspace, and the album title comes from the third part, Permanent Waves. It's full of the state of integrity. Rush's lyrics by drummer Neil Peart repeatedly come back to the theme of integrity. We are to believe, one assumes, that Rush has lots of it. Or maybe just that they aren't quite sure what it is. In The Spirit of Radio, doubt is cast by the lines, one likes to believe in the freedom of music, but glittering prizes and endless compromises shatter the illusion of integrity. There's no doubt at all about the lyrics in Entre Nous. They are witness pap and as trite as anything turned out in high school creative writing classes all over the United States and Canada. It starts with, we are secrets to each other, each one's life a novel no one else has read. Even joined in bonds of love, we're linked to one another by such slender threads. Entre Nous goes on, saying we are all alone and yet together like two passing ships. Among Rush fans, it's probably cool to know those priceless lyrics. Maybe the concerts here will turn into a big sing-along. Follow the bouncing ball under a giant projected image of Rod McCune. Okay, as I said, that person was less than impressed with the album Permanent Waves. Anyway, I'd love to get your feedback again on what these people had to say about it. And also, what was your first experience with this? Like I said, my first experience with Rush overall was those first two songs on this album. And it just kind of set me on this trajectory where I would spend my life just kind of really liking Rush. And one of my friends when I was a young teenager, a guy named Kurt Bartlett, he was a person that introduced me to a lot of the music that I really loved during my teenage years. He was just a couple years older than me, but he was nice enough to actually tell me, kind of share new music with me and tell me about bands and things. But I remember specifically he had a concert t-shirt, and I think as I recall, it was his very first concert t-shirt. And he had it hanging up in his closet, and he had retired it because he'd worn it thin, but it was from this album. And it was on the front of the t-shirt was this picture from the album cover. So I'd really love to hear from you. How many of you actually saw them on this tour, and what was that like for you? And did you have a t-shirt? And also, I'd love to get your feedback on this album cover, because we spent a few minutes talking about it at the beginning. What was your impression of this? And because a lot of people, we forget that the albums were the statement. The vinyl, this was the statement, because they had to downsample it and make it smaller for the 8-track and the cassette. Even the CD, you couldn't see everything quite as clearly. But the album itself then was the visual statement. And a lot of people, because you could buy those other formats, actually never had the album so that they could see these things. And anyway, I thought it'd be interesting for you to see this. Now, one other interesting thing about it. When years later they put out a 40th anniversary of this album, and then they had a news reporter on the front of the thing. In that picture, they do something different. Rather than the newspaper sitting over here, and rather than the woman there, the newspaper is over here, and the newspaper is the thing, rather than the dress, that breaks the frame. Anyway, just kind of interesting stuff. And sometimes it's easy to read too much stuff into this artwork, but it is still fun to talk about and notice those things and think perhaps there was other symbolism going on in like Hugh Syme's mind, that he was wanting to break the frame with a specific thing. Was there symbolism in that? Anyway, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Please, if you're not already following the channel, please follow the channel. Like the video. As always, share your comments. If there's other things about this that you find fascinating, other things that we should be bringing up when we talk about this album, please put that down in the notes. One of the greatest parts of this channel is just the comment section. So many interesting things that people have to say about their experiences at concerts, what they thought when they first heard these things, their favorite parts of these songs, the lyrics they loved, what they liked about the cover, symbols that other people didn't notice. Put those things down in the comments. We love seeing that stuff, and so do all the other people that watch these videos. It makes a difference for everybody's experience to have this really robust comment section. And lastly, we get contacted these days. The channel's kind of moving right now. We get contacted a lot through people. Go to the audiomover.com website, send us emails, send us information, and we really, really appreciate it. And then there'll be things like, hey, how can I help with the channel? How can I help it grow? One of the biggest things that you can do is just take this video or any video on our channel. We've got a lot of them now. Take any of those videos and just go share them. Go to your Facebook page. If you like this, if you're a Rush fan, you definitely know other Rush fans. There's no Rush fan is an island. You have other people around you that would like this, and share this with them. Because even though you probably know some of the things in these videos we share, there's probably a few things that you didn't. Some of these things in these articles you may have never heard before. And that's our aim, is that there'll be at least something in here that'll be a new experience for you when you watch these videos. And if nothing's new to you, at least it'll be new to my mother, who I know is the only person who watches every single episode. So sometimes when I go over things that are obvious to everybody else, just remember, she needs to know too. Hey, thanks for taking the time to watch this, and have yourself a fantastic day.